United States paratroopers have invaded Grenada with helicopter gunships. Our armed forces are engaging them in fair battle.
This is Alpha Company, 2nd Ranger Battalion from Fort Lewis. They were the first company on the ground last night.
The United States military toppled a Marxist government on a Caribbean island during the height of the Cold War. Operation Urgent Fury kicked off with over 7,000 US troops invading Grenada by air, land, and sea, briefly turning the tiny nation into an unlikely Cold War battleground.
Grenada, we were told, was a friendly island paradise for tourism. Well, it wasn't. It was a Soviet-Cuban colony being readied as a major military bastion to export terror and undermine democracy.
This battle takes us through the transition from the old-school Vietnam-era fighting doctrine to the high-tech network combat of today. But first, I want to talk to you about some fascinating things happening in the world of autonomous fighters. General Atomics Aeronautical Systems has been working with the United States Air Force for years to develop AI and machine learning for their Collaborative Combat Aircraft, or CCA. Everything General Atomics has done for the past 30 years has been about advancing the collaborative efficiency of human-machine teams. It's been an evolution from line-of-sight controls to long-distance satellite relays, adding automated processes such as automatic takeoff and landing, remote taxi, and other systems, all to protect warfighters. Over the past few years, General Atomics has developed the software and hardware crucial for CCA, cycling lessons learned from the field right back into the design process. No one else brings these strengths to the new paradigm needed for CCA. You're going to be hearing a lot more about this soon, because the Air Force says that the next aircraft in the CCA effort, which it has designated the YFQ-42A, is going to take flight later this year. Our thanks to General Atomics Aeronautical Systems for sponsoring this episode. It was the first time in history that the brand new Black Hawk helicopter was used in combat, and it was the introduction of head-worn night vision goggles on wide scale. It also sheds light on one of the times in recent history that US troops were sent on combat mission in their own hemisphere. But as we'll soon see, not everything went according to plan.
Doctors, nurses, and medics report to the hospital immediately. The Grenadian people are asked to block all roads and obstruct the enemy's progress.
Smoke-blackened skies mark the locations where the strongest resistance has been coming from. For the first time, the Americans, who allowed only their own news teams in, showed how their heavy artillery was trying to pound the opposition forces into an early submission.
Welcome to the gorgeous tropical island of Grenada. It's known as the Spice Isle because of its vast nutmeg and cinnamon exports, which are a legacy of its colonial past under French and British rule. In fact, it wasn't until 1974 that they finally gained their independence from the United Kingdom, but being free ain't easy because the transition was filled with violence. And get ready for a brief merry-go-round of leaders, because we're about to speed run through 4 leaders in Grenada in 7 years. Number 1 was Prime Minister Eric Gairy, who ruled with an iron fist through his paramilitary group called the Mongoose Gang. The Mongoose Gang was ruthlessly violent against his political opponents. They were widely feared despite their ridiculous name. In response to this, Grenada had a Marxist revolution by the New Jewel movement in 1979. They successfully overthrew Eric Gairy's government in a coup. Meet leader number 2, Maurice Bishop. Bishop called his new government the People's Revolutionary Government, which, like most governments that start with the word peoples, quickly started working with the Soviet Union. For the next 4 years, a ton of Soviet military and economic aid flooded into the country. They were on track to receive 50 Soviet armored personnel carriers, a bunch of anti-tank guns. But overall, Bishop kept the country officially non-aligned, meaning he didn't pick sides with the Soviets or the Americans, despite all the Cold War pressure to do so. However, being a professional fence-sitter isn't safe either. Bishop was seen as too moderate, so in classic Marxist revolutionary purging fashion, they executed him and his cabinet with a shot to the head. Meet leader number 3, his replacement, Bernard Coard. Coard took charge in 1983, and he understood the assignment. He was strongly opposed to the United States and expected this would earn him support from Cuba and the Soviet Union. But they ghosted him and refused to back him. So after 24 hours of being in charge, Coard stepped down. Meet leader number 4. Filling that vacuum in the chaos was a hardline communist military junta led by Austin Hudson. Hudson and his forces cracked down hard by imposing martial law with round-the-clock curfew on the whole population. Hundreds of American students were banned from leaving the island, they had all external communications cut off, and some were warned that they would be shot on sight if they violated the curfew. At this point, the United States government started to take notice. Grenada, even though they're only 133 square miles and have a small population of roughly 100,000 people, they still had major outsized geopolitical importance during the Cold War. It was located in close proximity to the sea lanes through which 56% of American imported oil sailed. The U.S. Department of Defense was worried that a now officially communist-aligned country of Grenada could easily disrupt American oil supplies. The two things the U.S. government goes crazier about are when their boats are touched or when their oil anywhere exists. Complicating matters, if the Cold War were to go hot in Europe, half of American reinforcements headed to Europe on transportation ships would travel past hostile countries that were now officially communist aligned.
The president intends to keep the troops there about 5 to 7 days. He wants to get in, accomplish the mission, and get out quickly.
Aside from these strategic concerns, the main justification for the invasion that were given by President Reagan were the rescue of American medical students and to stop construction of a new airport runway in Grenada that the US government claimed was designed to operate a Soviet long-range bomber base. The US claimed this Soviet-funded 10,000-foot runway was designed for the Soviets to land their massive AN-124 transport that required a stopping distance that long and would allow them to project power.
On the small island of Grenada, at the southern end of the Caribbean chain, the Cubans, with Soviet financing and backing, are in the process of building an airfield with a 10,000-foot runway. Grenada doesn't even have an air force. Who is it intended for?
However, Grenada rejected these points and stated the airport was simply being used to accommodate innocent commercial aircraft to carry tourists, and they claimed that the American students were in zero danger. The United States response was military intervention with Operation Urgent Fury. This was an invasion that the American military had been practicing for years, because in 1981, U.S. forces had been conducting something called Exercise Ocean Venture, where they would train on executing amphibious landing assaults in friendly nearby Puerto Rico. One man's boring training exercise is another man's actual invasion. The nearby country of Barbados was chosen as the launching point for the invasion. Grantley Adams International Airport was temporarily transformed to support military operations, so it became overrun with United States Delta Force, Navy SEALs, and Army Rangers. Vice Admiral Joseph Metcalf was placed in charge as the commander of what would become the largest American military operation since the Vietnam War. And soon to be famous, one-star General Norman Schwarzkopf's Storm in Norman was number 2, the advisor of ground operations. They were facing 1,300 Grenadian troops and a dozen armored BTRs. Intelligence reports from the island indicated there were up to 5,000 militia backing these forces. There were 600 or so Cubans who claimed that they were construction workers, but were also military reservists, and hours before the invasion they were given rifles by a Cuban officer and told to defend themselves and to fight to the death. In 1983, satellite images were often just covered by clouds or not high enough fidelity, and back then, GPS was in its infancy, so the whole United States government had zero maps that were good enough for Grenada for mission planning there. A soldier who thought outside the box purchased tourist maps of the island so intel planners could actually map out the invasion, and each soldier was given a photocopy of the map. At exactly midnight on October 25th, 1983, 2 companies from the 1st Battalion 75th Ranger Regiment took off from Georgia. At 0530, while it was still dark, they parachuted from an altitude of less than 500 feet so they could avoid fire from anti-aircraft guns. The Rangers quickly took out the Soviet anti-aircraft guns and BTRs near the airport with the help of some AC-130 gunships above. With the airport seized, 500 more Rangers were flown in by transport aircraft, followed by 5,000 reinforcements from the 82nd Airborne Division. A few hours later, 3 Grenadian BTRs attempted to counterattack. They were destroyed by the now battalion-sized element of U.S. troops.
The words of one American officer, they were using whatever it takes to free the island.
A massive part of Operation Urgent Fury was helicopter raids with the new Black Hawk helicopter, but they had mixed results. Of the 9 that they deployed, all were damaged and 4 were destroyed due to poor mission planning, where they flew directly into enemy fire many times without an escort and no element of surprise. A platoon of Delta operators infiltrated in Black Hawk helicopters and conducted the first US military fast rope operation on a target. But the prison that they were fast roping onto to get the political prisoners was significantly more guarded than they expected, with anti-aircraft guns posted just over a ridgeline. One of the AA guns managed to strafe one of the Black Hawks, killing the pilot and injuring several soldiers on board, and this forced them to make a crash landing. Meanwhile, a Navy SEAL team was sent on a rescue mission to retrieve Governor Paul Schoon, who was under house arrest by the military junta. Paul Schoon was the guy who officially had requested the invasion. He was important for diplomatic purposes. The SEALs made contact with Schoon at the mansion, but once they were inside, they were ambushed by armored personnel carriers that surrounded the building, and it trapped them inside. The SEAL team radio batteries died, preventing them from calling for fire. They had to improvise, adapt, and overcome. They decided to use the mansion's landline, and they made a call up to the US Navy, and they were able to get them on the line for fire support. But the Grenadian fire kept the SEAL team holed up. Schoon was important because a large portion of the Caribbean countries had received a secret message from him that had secretly been asking for the United States to invade his country. Since he was originally appointed by Queen Elizabeth, he held some level of legitimacy with Grenada. The US hoped that keeping him alive would help add legitimacy to their justification of the military intervention. After 14 hours of battle, 250 US Marines conducted a full amphibious beach landing just north. They made their way south and finally managed to reach Schoon and the SEALs by the second day. The Marines discovered 17 tons of documents, including top-secret agreements and weapons contracts between the Soviet Union and the New Jewel movement.
Russian and Cuban ammunition was found, as well as communications equipment. These are the weapons which Mr. Reagan says turned a friendly island paradise into a Soviet-Cuban colony, being readied to export terror and undermine democracy.
After the first days of fighting, even though there was a media blackout, news of the invasion spread fast, and reaction from the countries around the world to the invasion was mostly negative. Even the Soviet Union media was confused initially. They thought the US had invaded the city of Grenada in Spain. On the second day of the invasion, the 82nd Airborne was tasked with rescuing the American medical students. The only problem was that the army forces on the island basically had no helicopters that weren't damaged at that point, and putting a bunch of civilians in the back of shot-up helicopters was too risky. The army decided to try calling up the campus on the phone to see if the students would pick up. James Griffey, a resident assistant, managed to get a hold of the American troops, and extraction was planned over the phone. This never could have happened today because of phone anxiety. A group of Rangers air assaulted to the campus. One helicopter crashed after hitting a palm tree when landing, but the only armed resistance they faced was the campus police that happened to be there. One of the campus police actually managed to shoot one of the US Army Rangers with his pistol before fleeing, the only confirmed case in history of campus police shooting a US Army Ranger. The helicopter then flew the civilians back to the airport, but in the confusion and fog of war, 11 Rangers were left behind just as the sun was beginning to set. In the dark and without good radio equipment, they had no way of communicating, so they feared that they were going to get blown up by friendlies if they tried to infiltrate back to American lines. Instead, they grabbed an emergency raft from one of the downed helicopters and began paddling out to sea, eventually being spotted by patrols from the USS Caron. At this point, American forces began a sweep of the island, seizing Soviet weapon caches, arresting coup leaders, and sending Cuban workers back to Cuba. Local forces on the island surrendered in droves. Austin Hudson, the leader of the military junta, was arrested, along with Cord and members of the government who were responsible for executing Bishop and 16 others. They were sentenced to death, but commuted to life in prison, with Hudson being released in 2018 and passing away in 2022. After the dust had settled, U.S. forces had lost a total of 19 KIA, 152 wounded, and the defending Grenadian and Cuban forces combined lost roughly 65 KIA and 700 wounded, and lost 7 armored vehicles. Even the Soviet Union claimed one of their citizens was wounded at the embassy during Allied airstrikes. By the 3rd of November 1983, American forces had established a temporary advisory council with the help of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, and a transition government was established by Paul Schoon, who then held held elections a month later, appointing Herbert Blaise as the prime minister under the new National Party. Grenada is still a democracy today and will continue to be one as long as they don't vote for Marxism. From military planners' point of view, the invasion of Grenada highlighted weaknesses in U.S. military electronic communications that leaders would aim to fix when Reagan would shortly after this start pumping tons of money into defense. The intelligence failures of the battle caused the DoD to completely restructure and prevent that kind of miscommunication in the future. The lack of communication led to the development of the single-channel ground and airborne radio system known as SINGARs and GPS devices. Ultimately, though, while Urgent Fury was unpopular abroad, it was deemed an overall success and was popular within the American public.